Welcome to the New Albany Community Foundation's Jefferson Series presentation. Please silence all mobile devices as we begin our program. Thank you to the New Albany High School Jazz Band for providing tonight's entertainment. The Jefferson Series season is made possible by Abercrombie & Fitch and the Conway Charitable Lead Annuity Trust, Beatrice Wolper, trustee. Tonight's speaker sponsor is Russilli Construction Company. Additional support has also been provided by American Electric Power, Bob Boyd Lincoln of Columbus, NAI Ohio Equities, the National Veterans Memorial and Museum, Southeastern Equipment Company. And now, please welcome Les Wexner.
Thank you. Well, it's great to see this place filled up. Tonight's a very special evening and a very, I think, special day for Central Ohio and all of us in New Albany. We've asked to join us on the stage our veterans of our service, both active and retired, and some ROTC students. So I'd like you to please stand up and give them a round of applause. This year, on Veterans Day, we'll be opening the National Veterans Museum and Memorial down on the peninsula. And we hope to have former presidents, chiefs of staffs, the governors of all 50 states to come to this, having this national memorial and museum in our community. And we think it's an overdue thank you and honor and an appropriate memorial to veterans who have served. Over 40 million Americans have served in the services, and today we have approximately 22 million living Americans who've provided for our safety in all of our armed services. Tonight, the program having three significant military leaders and Dr. Fried Zakaria interviewing them, hopefully becomes an annual event where, as part of the Jefferson series, we can have significant leaders of our country come and talk about national security. So we're hoping to add to the agenda of authors, historians, people who are interested in children's health, family health, and the topics that we cover normally. So this is really quite a special evening. First, this is in alphabetical order. I just met General Michael Hayden today. He's going to come out. Retired 4-star general. Former head of the National Security Agency and the CIA. I told General Hayden when I met him today that he interrupts so many of our dinners because Abigail says he's on again, and then we stop eating and listen because he has such a good perspective of national security, and I think such a balanced view. It's a pleasure to welcome you and your wife to New Albany. Next, let me introduce General Peter Pace, former Vice Chairman and Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. General Pace and I met several years ago in California. Outstanding leader, obviously dedicated civil service. And last but not least, someone who's been with us in New Albany and has become an acquaintance, hopefully a good friend, is General Stanley McChrystal. All three of these gentlemen share something in common. They dedicated their life to protecting our country, and a life dedicated to civil service. And they also share in common 4 stars. These are most senior and most respected retired leaders of our military. And last, to help us with the interview, again, coming back to us, and a friend of ours and a friend of our communities, is Dr. Zakaria. So as Fareed says, let's get started.
Thank you, Les. I thought I would just begin by noting the point that Les also began on, which was the museum and memorial that is going to be this extraordinary national monument to educate and to remember. And I thought it would be worth talking for a moment with just one of our military leaders here about why this is so important. And I was struck by a story when Peter Pace retired from the military. After his retirement ceremony, he went to the Vietnam Memorial, and he left several handwritten notes with his general's rank insignia attached to each one. And each note was similar to the other, and they all said this: "These," meaning his general's rank insignia, "these are yours, not mine. With love and respect, your platoon leader, Pete Pace." Pete, why did you write that?
Well, first of all, thank you. It was very kind of you to even raise this topic. When I was a second lieutenant in combat, I lost some great Americans: Lance Corporal Guido Fernaro, and Corporal Chubby Hale, PFC Whitey Travers, Corporal Mike Witt, Staff Sergeant Freddie Williams, Lance Corporal Little Joe Arnold, and Lance Corporal Dan Miller. And I didn't get a scratch in 13 months in combat, and we started out in Hue City. I was in Hue City 50 years ago tonight. When we left Vietnam, I said my prayers because I didn't understand why I didn't even get a scratch. And the answer I came up with was I should stay on active duty and try to live my life in a way that pays respect to the way that they gave theirs for all of us in this room. So in every measure, the words on those cards are exactly right. Had they not died, had I not tried to live my life in a way that paid respect to the way they gave theirs, I probably would not have stayed on active duty, and I certainly would not have become a 4-star general. So I knew the day I retired that I had to some way demonstrate to them that I know that they were the reason that I had stayed, and certainly the reason why I was focused enough to be promoted.
Thank you. I just thought it was worth, dwelling for a moment on this issue because this forum coincides with marking this monument, and to thank the community and to thank, of course, Les and Abigail Wexner for their extraordinary generosity in thinking about this in just the right way, to thank the veterans, to honor them, to educate the country. And as part of that, I think we are going to try to do something unusual, which is we have this extraordinary firepower, literally and metaphorically. When Thomas Jefferson hosted every living American Nobel Prize winner for dinner at the White House, and he had Pablo Casal, the cellist, play, he began it by saying, "Ladies and gentlemen, we have never had so much brain power assembled in the White House before, at least not since Thomas Jefferson dined here alone." So I'm going to say, we've never had at a panel this much military, these many military brains assembled unless you count when, I don't know, George Marshall was here alone or somebody of that stature. But what I thought we'd do is we'd try to do this in a different way than most panels, and to give you a sense of what it's like to make some of these incredibly difficult decisions that the United States has to make as it confronts a very unruly world. And so we'll almost imagine that you are now in the National Security Council, and we're discussing these issues as they come up. And before we get to that, I just want to start out by setting the scene for the kind of world we're living in. I was just at the World Economic Forum in Davos. And the most striking thing about it was the disconnect, really for the first time that I've seen, between the sense of benign optimism about the economy and a sense of unease and disquiet about global politics. So the economy is doing well everywhere. It's not just the United States. Europe has recovered. Japan has actually almost miraculously had 7 straight quarters of economic growth. India is doing well. China is doing well. Latin America, large parts of it are doing well. Even Africa has fairly strong growth. And yet, underneath all that, there is a sense that global politics is shifting. And what I heard from people there was a fear that the United States was withdrawing from its historic role as the kind of guarantor and stabilizer of the world, a fear that Europe remains mired in its own concerns and therefore will not play that part, and a sense that into that vacuum are rising countries like China, Russia, that maybe do not have the same sense of the importance of a rule-based system, openness, trade, and such. And what would a world like that look like with all these powers, not just Russia and China, Iran, Saudi Arabia, Turkey? And so, Michael Hayden, I want to ask you this because you ran the CIA, and this kind of big picture analysis was part of what you did almost daily. How do you see this world? Would you set the stage somewhat differently? And what does it mean to have these new powers rising?
So, Farida, I guess I begin with us, all right? So we have to recognize that the global order that practically everyone in this room has spent their entire lifetime existing in has got a stamp on it, made in America, all right? It is the post-World War II, Bretton Woods, American liberal, World Bank, world order. And you invite us back here in 300 years, and we get to read the history books, we'll be able to tell you, we got good grades. We will be viewed as a benign superpower for what it is we have enabled for the last 75 years. But we're leaving that world, all right, the world that America made. And so the big question now for the rest of the world, Fareed, is you guys created 1.0. What's your attitude towards 2.0? Are you in? Will you help construct it? Will you contribute American power to its sustainment? I mean, look, we're imperfect, we made mistakes, but by and large, in the last 75 years, we did things for the good of the order very often, not just for narrowly defined American national self-interest. And now the question is, do we still hug that role? And actually, this might surprise folks, we've seen a bit of continuity between President Obama and President Trump. Both of those presidencies are about pulling back from that commitment. Under President Obama, it was retrenchment. Actually, one of your colleagues in New York in the New York Times, David Sanger, said it was about better aligning the definition of American interests with the realities of American power. So we have begun to pull back from the very robust role that we played in Global Order 1.0. The word I got from our friends during the Obama years was simply, where are you guys? Right? And now we've got President Trump, who's got the same resource challenge, but I think he's got a different philosophical bent. I think President Obama knew we had to pull back because we just couldn't sustain our effort. I think President Trump disagrees with the fundamentals of the effort. All right? Here, it's America first. And what you're reading from the folks you've talked to, Fareed, is they're thinking that means America alone. And rather than doing things for the good of the order, we talk as if we will do things for immediate, transactional, present tense, win-lose, rather than long-term efforts. So what I'm hearing from our friends now is not where are you guys, but we miss the America we knew. All right. So there is unarguably this pullback. Doesn't have to be permanent. We can adjust this. We're bright people. We can change direction. But right now the arc is pretty clear. And now what you're seeing are other nations saying there's space up here. So you've got the Russians, for example, back in the Middle East for the first time in 50 years. Why? Because we left a big open space on the stage in Syria for them to go in. So to parse this out, and I'll end with this, the Chinese moving into some of this space is a natural progression, one that we should attempt to manage rather than prevent. This is a growing, emerging power. Not so the Russians. The Russians aren't resurgent. The Russians are revanchist. And I have no instincts that tell me they would be a good contributor to the global order in current circumstances, where the Chinese, I see reason to deal. The great fear I have is not that the Chinese move forward, or even worse, the Russians. Nobody moves forward. And you've got no one out there, again, powerful, involved, fairly benign nation, doing things for the good of the order rather than narrow self-interest. Gary Cohn, chairman of the Council of Economic Advisors, H.R. McMaster, whom all of us up here know, now the National Security Advisor, if you were going to order American internationalists from central casting, you'd have picked these two guys. And they signed an op-ed, I don't know that they wrote it, but they signed an op-ed in the Wall Street Journal in May of last year, saying the world is not a community of nations. Boy, let me tell you how that was read throughout the rest of the planet.
They know who they work for. I mean, I think that's part of it. Pete Pace, I want to pick up on one point that Michael Hayden alluded to. Russia is the country that seems most active, and yet it's not a rising power. Russia has an economy the size of the Netherlands. Russia is in many ways in decline fundamentally. Its population is actually shrinking. How do you read the situation with Russia? What are its intentions, and how should the United States deal with it at a kind of fundamental level?
Yeah, you hit most of the points already, but the truth of the matter is that they want respect.
Yeah.
When the Soviet Union disintegrated, Russia was left standing by itself. And we, as a nation, from our perspective, did not treat them badly, but they felt like we treated them for about 10 years like a second-class, third-class power. And that grated on them. I'll give you an example. President Bush told me, when I was chairman, to work out a deal with my Russian counterpart where we could train together. And we did so, his team and mine. And the U.S. Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff is not in the chain of command, meaning as chairman, I didn't tell any of our troops to do anything. The president, the secretary told me to issue orders in their names. I would say to General so-and-so, the president directs, the secretary directs. So I was not in the chain of command. So I believed that my counterpart, Yuri Belyaevsky, would want to have a commander who was his command equal. Jim Jones was Supreme Allied Commander Europe as an American, but he was also the European theater commander. So we set up the documents to sign, this training document to sign, with Yuri signing for the Russians and Jim Jones signing for us. For about 6 months, it just sat there. I went to Russia on a pre-planned visit. I sat down with Yuri and I said, Yuri, your president told you, my president told me, we got these things done, but you haven't signed yet. He said, no. I said, do you know that I'm not in the chain of command? He said, yes. I said, if I sign this paper, will you sign this paper? He said, yes. During dinner, we had the colonels go out, rewrite the draft cover page. It came in, and before dinner was over, he signed it and I signed it because he wanted the respect of being my equal. That's when my eyes were opened up to how badly the Russians felt they had been mistreated. Now you've got Putin, who basically is the latest czar, and he wants to rebuild the glory of the Soviet Union. And he is just cold enough and cold-hearted enough and crafty enough to really drive toward that, even though everything that was been said about their death rate, their longevity is going down, their economy is coming down, Their resources are not what they used to be. They have huge problems. And because of that, it's actually more dangerous because they've got to find a way to be treated as equals, and their population and everything else about their country is going downhill.
You know, the Russian case is I just want to echo something Peter Pace was saying. It's a fascinating one, and one forgets that you often have trouble in history, not just from rising powers, but from declining powers. So we often think of World War I as having been started by Germany. But technically what actually happened was it was started by Austria-Hungary. It was started because the Austro-Hungarians decided to declare war on Serbia because of an assassination that takes place in Sarajevo. And why do they do that? Austria-Hungary is a declining power economically, militarily, demographically. But it wants to show that it's still a player, and it wants respect. And so it decides to take on this unyielding position and forces its ally, Germany, to provide unconditional support. And that begins to trigger a series of cascading alliances in Europe. But the core is there, that it was the declining power that wanted to, in some way, demonstrate its power that ended up getting the world into trouble. So I sometimes think of that when I watch Russia versus China, and I think, Mike Hayden, you made this point. The Chinese have a greater stake in stability. The Russians, in an odd way, are spoilers, because if the world is more unstable, the single most important thing that happens is the price of oil goes up, which means the Russian economy does well. So they have actually a perverse incentive for a certain degree of instability. Stan McChrystal, you were legendary for being able to do these. This is a kind of James Bond times 1,000 stuff of going in the middle of the night and, shall we put it this way, getting rid of bad guys. What I want to ask you about in this circumstances, because you really were the, it's all very well to talk about world order and to talk about the United States' stabilizing role, but somebody has to go in there and actually execute. And that means doing things that are very hard, very complicated, with very limited information, but most importantly, working with others in foreign countries. And I think we often forget this, that there's a great deal of what the United States does that is in partnership with other countries. We have 59 treaty allies in the world, for example. China has one, and it's North Korea. Right? That's the difference between the American system and so I want you to talk about, how do you think those countries, what do they want from America? How did you find it, how did it work well when the United States was able to ally, and what were the problems?
Yeah, and thanks for asking that and putting it that way, Fareed, because there is a certain seductiveness to taking a small group of American commandos or heroes and going and doing something unilaterally. It's just sort of neat and clean, and it feels good, but it's never sustainable. It's sort of like scratching an itch, but you haven't solved the problem at all. Everything we do that lasts over time, we do with partners. And so if you think about working with another nation, like another nation working with us, the first thing it gets back to is what both Mike and Pete mentioned. People want to be respected. When I assumed command in Afghanistan, there were 46 nations in the coalition, and they varied broadly in military capability, in their recency in war, in how much freedom they had from their political masters back in their home state. So the first thing I was told is go there and use the Americans and sort of wrap heads on all our allies and get them to do stuff the way we do it. But that's not what works. What works first is to find out what people can do, what's really in their capacity. Don't criticize them for what they can't do if that's not changeable, but build up their ability, their teamwork with you. Show them the respect to pass information to them. Show them the respect to give them capacity that they might not otherwise have, and help them develop. We developed a process in Afghanistan called shoulder to shoulder with the Afghan forces. And it was imperfect, for sure. But the point was, if you work shoulder to shoulder with someone, it's a completely different relationship than if you're standing up and looking down. Everybody resents being looked down at. Even if they think that we have more capacity than they do, nothing hurts and or is resented more than if you are disdainful of people who theoretically are your partners and theoretically are your allies. So I think it's a mindset. I think it's, and we don't do this well in our nation or in our military. We don't learn foreign languages well. After Pearl Harbor was attacked. 5,200 Americans were taught Japanese in the military to a fluent state. We didn't get probably to 200 learning Dari, Pashto, or Arabic after 9/11. We just need to think that it's the relationship that matters long term. And I know that's not sexy. They don't make movies about that. But at the end of the day, that's what's going to make a difference.
Can I just reinforce what Stan said? I used to talk to all my station chiefs before they went out. All right, these are the CIA leadership in a variety of other countries. And my standard homily was, when you meet with a liaison, which was our word for the partner, right? When you meet with a liaison, remember two things. You are the only superpower in the room. Two, don't act like it. Okay? They know the first, they're looking for the second.
All right, now we're in the NSC. We're in the National Security Council. I'm going to outline the kind of problems that, are the ones the United States has to deal with. And I'm going to start with what I have often thought of as the hardest problem of all. It's not the most important one, but it's the hardest one of all. The United States is in its 17th year in the war in Afghanistan. And yet, every time U.S. forces withdraw from some area, the Taliban is able to be resurgent. One of the fundamental reasons for this, perhaps the fundamental reason, is that many parts of the Taliban have safe havens in Pakistan, which is the neighboring country. So they attack and then they retreat to a place where neither the Afghan army nor American troops can go, because you'd be crossing an international border, you'd be violating the sovereignty of Pakistan. We did it once for Osama bin Laden, and Mike would tell that story later, but right now we're not doing it. So what to do? The Pakistani military has decided this is a neat way to keep Afghanistan unstable and to therefore be dominant and to keep India off balance. The Bush administration tried to give them a lot of aid and tough love in some ways. The Obama administration tried to scold them, but didn't do much that was, I'd say, very different. The Trump administration decided it was going to get tough, really tough, and suspend military aid to Pakistan. In the last week, what seems to have happened is that the Pakistanis have said, all right, you want us to show you what we can do, and they have ratcheted up the violence in Afghanistan. You have had 4 of the worst terror attacks in Afghanistan's history. The Kabul government is teetering. And so the way I look at it, it's the hardest problem in the world, because if you give money to Pakistan, they support militants. And if you don't give money to Pakistan, they support militants. So Stan McChrystal, what is the answer? You're now in the...
Oh, and I got these 2 learned colleagues. And first is, I'm going to just rewind a little bit. You go into an NSC meeting, and I wasn't in near as many as General Pace or General Hayden, but everybody in there acts like they were born there. They act like, hey, I hang around here every day, and you get in there, and every time I felt like I was this absolute interloper, and I had no business being in there, and everybody was looking at me like, who are you? And, and you got to get over that pretty quickly, because it's all an act on everybody's part. The NSC is this rarefied environment in which everybody is trying to act like they got the deal going. And so it takes a little while to sort of get over that fear, at least it did for me. When you think about Pakistan, I don't have the right answer, and I'm embarrassed to say, but what I would do is I'd say, think about it this way. If you think about the last 50 or 60 years of our relationship with Pakistan, they fought 3 wars following their separation from India, the partition. And in the second 2 wars, they thought that they had a treaty with the United States that said we would aid them. In both cases, when those wars started, we said, doesn't apply in this case. Then when we wanted to go start relations with China, they facilitated Dr. Kissinger's entry into China. Then when it came time to put pressure on the Soviets inside Afghanistan, they became a conduit, an imperfect one for sure, but they were right along the border and taking Russian threats as American arms and money went in to fight our Cold War enemies. So there was a mindset that said, we're doing this for you. We are being your brave partner in the Cold War. And yet, when we turned around, India developed a nuclear weapon. Then when Pakistan, and we didn't do anything. And Pakistan developed one, and we implemented the Pressler Amendment, the only law focused against a single nation. And so from their standpoint, if you flip the lens around, we're imperfect allies. We want what we want, and we don't really care what they want. Now, whether that's right or wrong doesn't matter. That's what they think. And after the Pressler Amendment, we cut off military-to-military assistance and interaction. We didn't bring Pakistani officers to American schools. And I remember I would go to Pakistan, and you would deal with the Pakistani army. You're very professional. And everybody above a certain rank, it was about colonel and above, had been to the United States for military schools. They talked, you have one relationship, and then that tranche below them, about a decade's worth, had a completely different view. They didn't get us. They were very standoffish. They were professional. So I make the point that if you are in their shoes, you see the world differently. If you are in their shoes, rationally, you think that we are going to get what we want in the region, then we are going to turn our back as soon as we've got it. So if you start from that, it doesn't mean that they're evil. It just means they've got a very different worldview, which means that I think just sitting across the table and talking more loudly or banging the table is unlikely to be the right solution. I think we've really got to be nuanced, and we got to try to build a relationship over time.
And there's another part to this too, and I'm about to point fingers at somebody else, so I'm going to point a couple at myself first. When I was vice chairman and chairman, it never dawned on me that I needed to speak up to the American people about how long a commitment we had going into Iraq and Afghanistan. I was born in 1945. My entire life we've had troops in Germany. My entire life we've had troops in Japan. Most of my life we've had troops in Korea. It was just second nature to me that when we occupied Afghanistan and we occupied Iraq, that of course we were going to be there not weeks and months and years, but decades. That my grandkids would be talking about the troops who were stationed in Afghanistan and Iraq, not as oppressors, but as we are in Germany and the other countries I mentioned, as guests. It didn't dawn on me that that was an important thing to do. So along comes President Obama. For whatever reason, he wants to be out of Iraq and Afghanistan. He withdraws our troops from Iraq way too soon. And he creates a vacuum. Now, I couldn't tell you ISIS was going to go in there. ISIS didn't have that name when I was responsible. But you would know that something bad's going to happen. Now you go to Pakistan, and you have a country that's a really tough neighborhood to live in. How do you know where the United States stands if we don't follow through on our commitments? The Pakistanis will look at us and say, well, you said you were going to take care of Iraq, you said you were going to take care of Afghanistan, you kind of went in for a little while, now you've come out of Iraq. How long before you go out of Afghanistan? You can see from their viewpoint that trying to be a good partner of ours, which is difficult for them to do in their own backyard. I'm not making excuses for them, it's just a tough neighborhood. And they've got Taliban, they've got terrorists, even those who want to, and not everybody wants to, even those who want to in Pakistan, who are in leadership positions, have a hard time knowing how long it's going to be before they get cut off at the knees because the United States says, oh, we're done here, good luck.
So Mike, let me sharpen the question then. It sounds like from what both Stan McChrystal and Pete Pace are saying, maybe the Trump administration didn't think through the idea of an ultimatum, a cutoff of aid, because as I say, I mean, it has had two totally predictable outcomes. One is that the Pakistanis moved closer to the Chinese. China has essentially intimated it will replace, I think the aid was only $250 million. The Chinese already provide several $1 billion of aid to the Pakistanis. But the second is that they're demonstrating that they have leverage. So be that as it may, as I say, imagine you're in the NSC, here's where we are now. How humiliating is it to dial back?
Well, it would be hard because what you've got here is a branding issue fundamentally for the president who really wants to present an image of I'm tough, I'm not like the other guys. And so right. Walking anything back for this president will be very, very hard, I know we're going to get to Korea, right. But that really scares me in Korea.
And to be fair, that's probably true of every president who comes in wanting to be different from the previous guy, and then to unwind that.
But there's an extra dose of personality and personalism with regard to this president that maybe you don't see in some
I think that might
others.
be an understatement.
Yeah.
Yes.
So let me just elaborate on what my colleagues have already said. Hussein Haqqani was the former Pakistani ambassador to the United States. Very educated man, actually a friend of a lot of Americans. Hussein's got a wonderful phrase when he talks about our military involvement. He says, "You Americans never lose wars. You lose interest." And that actually is a good encapsulation. Look, it's not just us. It's them. And I must say, from time to time, I've allowed myself to say the Pakistanis are the ally from hell, right? Because they're very, very difficult. But it may be because not just of our inconsistent policies, it may be trying to define the nature of who it is they are. Just bear with me for a second, because I think this is very important. You know, I know what constitutes a German. It's blood, all right? I think I know what constitutes an American. It's an idea. You know, you come here, you study it, you agree to it, you're one of us. What constitutes a Pakistani? All right? What creates a Pakistani identity? Two things. One, it's not India. Okay? And that is a fundamental part of the creed of self-identification. I talked to an Indian who said, you know, if you take Islam away from a Jordanian, he's still a Jordanian. You take Islam away from an Egyptian, he's certainly an Egyptian. He says, you take Islam away from a Pakistani, he's an Indian. Okay. So one element of Pakistani identity is that it's not India, and the other is Islam. Okay? Now, Hussein Haqqani, the ambassador, you guys lose interest, wrote a history of Pakistan. He called it Between Mosque and Military. And actually, power in Pakistan shifts back and forth between religious fundamentalists and the armed forces, neither of which are consistent with the American vision as to how progressive countries should govern themselves. And so what you've got are the Pakistanis on one day being very Islamic, on another day being very anti-democratic. And they never settle on the middle ground.
So again, I'm going to push Stan McChrystal. You're in the Situation Room. You've gotten over your jitters, and the president says to you, "Everyone tells me you're the smartest commander in the field. You're the guy who can get anything done." And this is what people used to say about Stan McChrystal. We're 17 years in this war, and I'm going to ask you the question Lyndon Johnson used to ask at that same National Security Situation Room. We're supposed to have the greatest military in the world, Lyndon Johnson used to say. And how come we can't beat a bunch of bandits in black pajamas, which is what the Viet Cong used to wear? Well, the Taliban don't wear black pajamas, but you know, people will often say, well, the Afghan army needs to be educated. The Taliban is illiterate. They need to be trained to fight. The Taliban fights. They need to be taught courage. The Taliban has plenty of courage. And by the way, they don't even get paid, right? So what's going on here? I mean, just at a fundamental level, how do you convince people? Because I think the one area where I think the way that General Pace described is a little different is we were in Germany and Korea as deterrent forces against an external enemy. We were not there helping those countries constitute themselves against internal challenges on an ongoing civil war. And that's the part the American people have a little difficulty with. If you were to say to people, you're in Afghanistan to defend against Russia or Pakistan, I think they'd be signed up to be there for 5 decades. But how do you win this war?
Well, it's really hard. And I would say first, there's something that came out, 20 years ago called asymmetric warfare. And what that tried to communicate was a very technologically advanced nation would run into an opponent who would use maybe lower technology, different tactics. And so you're trying to fight one war and they're trying to fight a completely different war. I think that was true in Afghanistan, but that wasn't the real way I interpreted asymmetric warfare. In Afghanistan, also true in Iraq for a period, and even more true in Vietnam, there was an asymmetric level of commitment. If we look back to what happened in Vietnam, the United States tried to use gradual escalation to, like a rheostat, to ratchet up the pressure on North Vietnam till they would quit. what they found is North Vietnam didn't have a point at which they would quit. There was no limit to their commitment. If you get in Afghanistan, the Taliban are much less ideologically committed than the North Vietnamese were. They are much less organized. They are much less highly thought of by the population. Their actual polling numbers are lousy. But the Taliban and the people opposed to the government are asymmetrically committed because they're there. They're there last year, they're there this year, and they're going to be here next year and 10 years. So they think of things in an entirely different way. If you think about going into a village, we would drive into a village as outsiders and we would offer to give them medical support, we'd give them security and whatnot, and the Taliban could just wait. And if we could give security for 29 days out of the month, that was great. One day of the month, the Taliban get in at night and they simply say, you know, the Americans aren't going to be here forever. And when the Americans leave, you're going to pay a big price. Put yourself in the position of the local farmer or district leader, and suddenly you're sitting there thinking, wow, I may want the Americans to win, but I'm not confident, as General Pace said, that they're going to stay. Therefore, I'm going to hedge my bet. I'm at least going to stay in the middle. And if necessary, I'm going to lean the other way. It is absolute human nature. It's survival. It's rational. It's all of those things. So in reality, it is very, very difficult to defeat a movement like that with that level of commitment, particularly when the government of Afghanistan that you're supporting has so little legitimacy because of corruption and lack of effectiveness. And so they have not been able to build up the kind of support you need. What I thought when I took command in Afghanistan in 2009 was, and I still believe this is true, although we executed imperfectly, what we were missing was confidence. What we needed to convince all the players was, we are going to be here, we're going to stay. We are going to stay committed to you. We are going to be something that you can count on. And I think once people believe that, then suddenly it's not the battered child syndrome waiting to see if a parent's going to leave them. Then they recalculate. But I think we've not been able to get over that hump. And I think our opponents and our allies, there's just been too much uncertainty.
Wouldn't you say also, Stan, and maybe I asked Peter Pace this because you had to deal with the same thing in Iraq. I would add one twist to what Stan McChrystal said. It's not just confidence in the US, it's confidence in the local government, that they are legitimate, that they are strong, that they are viable. And I think this was one of the things that plagued the Iraq operation. It still plagues Afghanistan. How do you do it? And yet the United States can't confer legitimacy on these governments, can it?
We cannot kill our way to peace. What we can do is have our military provide a stable environment inside of which the Afghan government, in this case, can start providing for its citizens, hopefully with our help. When a man feels like life tomorrow is going to be better than today, and life the day after is going to be better than tomorrow, then they have some hope for himself and his family. When they don't see that hope, and all they know is that on day 30 the Taliban's coming back, they have no incentive to take any kind of risk at all to try to help. One of the biggest problems we have is that the only thing we have that we deploy is our intelligence assets and our military. Well, I'm sorry, but after you've taken over a country, somebody has to run the electricity, somebody has to run the water, somebody has to run the gas, somebody has to do things that US military folks haven't been trained to do, but we do by default because there's nobody else around to do it. So I'm back to my basic theme, which is when you occupy a country, like we did in Iraq and Afghanistan, you have a moral obligation to leave that country better off than you found it. And part of that moral obligation, I believe, is not just to go in there with military, but to go in there with doctors and teachers and mayors and help that country help itself, so that at the end of the day, the citizens begin to believe in their own government and begin to believe that tomorrow is better than today. And that's what you need to turn the corner. We cannot do this from outside. We can help from inside, but we've got to help them do it themselves.
You know, I think your comments are so important at a time when the State Department's budget is being cut dramatically and the military is getting what is perhaps a needed increase. I almost wish that Jim Mattis, the Secretary of Defense, would go over to President Trump and say, take $10 billion you're going to give me and give it to the State Department so that we can do some of this more holistic approach. But now we're going to switch, because the thing is, when you read about history, particularly presidencies, you read, there's a chapter on Afghanistan and Pakistan, and there's a chapter on North Korea. But actually, in real life, they're happening on the same day. And sometimes the same meeting, you have to be dealing with both. So Mike Hayden, you've seen the administration make a series of belligerent statements about North Korea that have been quite striking. The era of strategic patience is over. We are not going to allow North Korea to acquire a nuclear missile that could reach the United States. Well, your successor in the job, Mike Pompeo, says it's going to be 3 months. And now President Trump has said, I will not allow it to happen. When you issue a threat like that, you better be sure that you know what you're going to do 3 months from now. So let's assume you're in the National Security Council meeting, they're saying, Michael Hayden, what should we do 3 months from now when all indications are they will have such a missile?
Yeah. So it begins with the background, and President Trump says he inherited a mess in Korea, and in this case he's right. All right, he inherited a mess. A year or two ago, people like me were saying, within our current definition of acceptable risk, okay, with what we were willing to do or not do, within our current definition of acceptable risk, it was inevitable that within this administration, sometime, the North Koreans would be able to reach North America with an indigenously produced ICBM that had an indigenously produced nuclear weapon on top of it, within our current definition of acceptable risk. And so I quite understand the broad strategic movement. Well, we might want to change our definition of acceptable risk. And we have got, we are the prime mover here. We are the destabilizer. We're the one poking at the problem, trying to increase pressure on the North Koreans. So I get the broad strategic movement. We're redefining acceptable risk. We're willing to excite the situation. Now, I don't think we're doing it elegantly. I don't think we're doing it carefully. We've got all sorts of imprecise, I'm being kind here, rhetoric over here about Fire and Fury and Little Kim and Rocket Man and so on, all right? So, but the reality is, and this I'm not sure the administration has yet embraced sufficiently, he is not irrational. He, Kim, is coldly calculating. He would be irrational if he gave up his nuclear weapons. There are no equations in the foreseeable future where he could see a world more safe for him and his regime if he didn't have this kit. And so for the longest time, we have simply said, this isn't going away. We will never get him to zero. We might be able to nudge him a little bit on the edges here, but he is going to be a nuclear power. It's not just regime survival, it's personal survival. And so now when we go over here in our excitation of the situation and say that the only thing we will accept is regime disarmament, we have created the null set for a peaceful resolution. There are only two off-ramps here, right? Negotiate or disarm through force. And there's no one of my background who thinks we are capable of disarming through force without catastrophic conflict on the Korean Peninsula. I've been heartened a bit that President's rhetoric hasn't gotten more precise, but he's kind of being imprecise now about negotiations as opposed to last summer when he had all that rhetoric about forceful military action. So I think the government is hugging a bit more. We're probably going to end up sitting down talking to these guys.
Stan McChrystal, is there a military option in Korea? Could the United States hit North Korea in some way, either as preventive or punishment, or what do you think?
We could hit North Korea, and we could defeat North Korea in a period of probably weeks. But the problem is, for the last 50 years, they've been embedding artillery along the demilitarized zone, in the mountains and ridges along the demilitarized zone. So even without a single nuclear weapon that worked, they could have an eruption of conventional artillery, much of which will range the Seoul catchment area, where the population is, which is 20 million people, and about 100,000 Americans there. So the reality is, even in their death throes of a week or more, they could rain enough artillery that would take time to destroy in those ridge lines, that there would be potentially millions of casualties. Now, we would have won. We would have lost all of those people, and then we would get the prize, a destroyed North Korea. And then, what do you do with that? So that's what makes this so hard. It's not flip a switch and destroy them. It's flip a switch and pay a pretty significant price.
But we're not without options. When you're having a really difficult problem, if staying focused on that problem isn't working, make it a bigger problem. The solution to this thing, in my mind, at least in a major way, is through Beijing and with China. And if you happen to be Chinese right now and you see what's going on between North Korea and the United States, you got to be all smiles. You're building reefs in the South China Sea. You're doing everything you want to do while this stuff's going on over here and has the United States' attention. We should leverage China. They don't like when we arm Taiwan. We should talk to them about that. I'm not saying give up on Taiwan. I'm not saying abandon Taiwan. I'm saying we should stick with our policy of one China. We should stick with our policy of peaceful reunification. But perhaps a few $1 billion less per year in arms sales to Taiwan might get the Chinese attention. Oh, by the way, we're providing a nuclear umbrella for Japan. How would the Chinese feel about the United States saying, well, listen, if North Korea is going to have nukes, maybe we should encourage Japan to have nukes? They would go apoplectic about that. So you can have a discussion around this issue that brings to the table China, the United States, South Korea, North Korea, Japan, and you can find a solution, I believe, that has something in it for everybody. As Mike says, you're not going to get the North Koreans to give up their nukes. Everybody who has is dead. Gaddafi's dead. The Ukraine had the third largest nuclear arsenal on the planet. They gave it up for a promise from Russia and the United States that we would protect their sovereignty. You ask the people in Crimea what they think about that. So you've got to have a dialogue that's based on people's interests. And there are interests in this for China, and there are interests in this for North Korea and the other powers to have a dialogue. But if we stay focused on U.S. versus North Korea, we're not going to get there.
All right. The world moves on, so do we. Another issue at the same NSC meeting is Iran. The president has criticized the Iran nuclear deal from the start. But in the last few weeks, he said something more than that, which is he has said he will not continue to support it. The technical process by which that happens is the president has been waiving the application of sanctions on Iran because they are part of this deal. He says he's not going to waive them anymore, which in effect means the United States would be unilaterally abrogating the Iran deal. What would the consequences of that, Michael Hayden, be? How do you see this? Because this is going to happen 3 months from now, by the way.
Yeah.
All these problems that I'm describing are all live.
Yeah, we are on a shot clock here. It's a 120-day cycle, and the president has to make a decision. And the last time he said, well, okay, I'll let it ride, he said, this is the last time I'm going to let it ride. So this is about 100 days out from now. A way to think about this, and it'll be very brief. Our problem set with Iran is in 3 baskets. Basket 1 is nuclear now. What's the Iranian nuclear situation now? Basket 2 is what's the Iranian nuclear situation in 10 years when the current deal begins to age off. And basket 3 is everything else the Iranians are doing. Yemen, Syria, Iraq, Hezbollah, Bashar al-Assad, it goes on. Actually, I wasn't a fan of the nuclear deal. I wrote a lot of op-eds kind of saying there's some bait and switch here. You should have pushed harder. Why are you agreeing to that? But even I will admit the nuclear deal keeps the Iranians further away from a weapon than they would otherwise be, and that's probably going to last for about the better part of a decade. Okay? And so I am not a fan of blowing up the one part of the basket set that is kind of in an okay place. And that's the one the president's about ready to hit the plunger. Now, I would lean on the Europeans to say, what's going to happen here in 10 years? We got to start working on that now. And I would really go to work on the Iranians and what it is they're doing everywhere else. But we seem to be fixated on blowing up the one part of the bilateral relationship that's got us in kind of an okay place.
The thing I worry about is that were we to do this, the Iranians might decide, okay, well, we don't have to abide by the deal either and just begin, then we have another North Korea problem, except this time it's in the heart of the Middle East. But more likely, I think they will say, fine, if the Americans aren't abiding by it, we'll continue to abide by it, and since everybody else is now trading with us, we'll just trade with Russians and Chinese and Europeans. But it does give them an incentive, or to put it differently, it gives them no disincentive to dial back the anti-American or the destabilizing activities in the region. And Stan McChrystal, you were in Iraq when Iran was able to do this. What I'm struck by is Iran is a very sophisticated player. They've been at this for 5,000 years. This is perhaps the oldest nation in the world. Certainly the oldest nation with a roughly contiguous territory, with Tehran as its capital. They have talk about asymmetrical ways that they can destabilize the Middle East.
And they do it very, very well. If you look at the head of the IRGC, General Soleimani, I mean, there is a pro who does things like most American militaries sort of wish we could, although he's got a lot broader portfolio. They operated inside Iraq with great sophistication, with great lethality. They leveraged allies. They operate in Lebanon. They operate in Israel. And so the first thing to understand is what they execute with a really high level of professionalism. What I would do is I would step back and say, where do we want to be with Iran in 20 years? And I think if we look at the Iranian population, at the Iranian internal politics, our best bet is to try to oppose what they do on the ground, and we have to be hard-nosed about it, not be bombastic, but try to shape our relationship so there is something 20 years from now. The one thing I believe is if we overreact and attack Iran in a way that is viewed by the Iranian population as unfair, then you'll have 80 million Iranians suddenly unified in a way that would be really, really frightening. And I think that's not in our best interest. So this is one of those cold/hot wars that we shouldn't be afraid to take on at that level, but not try to escalate it beyond that, in my view.
Pete Pace, you had to deal with the same issue. In fact, there was a little bit of controversy in your time when you were actually pointing out that it was not as clear that Iran was as involved in some of the destabilizing activities in Iraq. Was that because they were so good at covering it up? Was it because you thought that sometimes you could actually imagine a non-confrontational relationship with Iran?
No, I absolutely believed then and believe now that Iran was in fact feeding weapons into Iraq. The question I was asked was, could I prove it? And I was chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and I couldn't prove it. There's a difference between knowing it in your hearts, seeing the effect on a battlefield, and being able to say, this item right here with this serial number was manufactured right there in Tehran. Couldn't do that. So I was not at all, when I said those things, defending Iran. I was simply stating the fact that I couldn't prove it. Having said that, Iran's a sovereign nation. There are lots of sovereign nations. We've got to be careful how much we think we can do about forcing people to do things that we want them to do. If, in fact, it's difficult with Iran, which it is, then how about, rather than worrying about how to do something about things inside of Iran, other than encourage the protests and perhaps fund the protests, how about focusing on Saudi Arabia? Saudi Arabia says they have $300 billion they want to spend on modernizing their defense. How about we help them, rather than just buy the latest airplanes and the latest ships and the latest whatevers, actually help them put together a modern military. They don't have a modern military. They have wonderful, wonderful equipment, and they don't have a military trained to it. Now, the Crown Prince is working on it right now. And in fact, I'm working with a team that's blessed by our State Department and blessed by our DOD to go in and help them restructure their military in a way that 20 years from now, they'll have a functioning meritocracy military that allows them to have a deterrent to Iran. Saudi Arabia looks at Iran as their natural enemy. We shouldn't be throwing gas on that fire, but we also ought not to look the other way when, rather than trying to spend money on how do we take away Iran's nuclear weapons, might we then focus our energy, both financial and intellectual, on helping the Saudis build up a capacity that's a balance to Iran in the region.
You know, all of you have talked about something that seems to me very important that Americans don't think enough about, which is, what does the world look like for the other country that we're dealing with? And I remember in this context, even in Iran, I was in Tehran, I was talking to a liberal in Tehran, with reformists who wanted democracy in Tehran, and we got to talking about the nuclear deal. And I mentioned the issue of ballistic missiles, which is not covered in the nuclear deal, but irritates the United States because Iran keeps developing ballistic missiles. And this guy said to me, he said, well, just put yourselves in our shoes. We fought an 8-year war with Saddam Hussein, in which Saddam Hussein attacked us. We were all alone. They attacked us with weapons of mass destruction, chemical weapons, with missiles. They were supported by the West. We didn't have any missile capacity. So now we look at that, and this is a war in which almost 1 million Iranians died. We look at that and say to ourselves, we need a missile capacity. We need defense capacity. And that's why we're building ballistic missiles. I'm not sure I completely buy it all, but the point is just, you always remember there is a backstory, and there is the question of what that country's history is and what that country's psychology is as a result of this history.
What you just described is one of the core roles of intelligence, all right? That you give your decision maker a view of the world through the lens of the other decision maker. I'm fond of saying that, people say, well, did you predict that? And I go, well, we're kind of not in the predicting business. We're kind of in the understanding business. And what it is we're charged to do is to provide context for American decision makers so that they can create the left and right-hand boundaries of logical, legitimate policy discussions. And without getting too political, one of the problems we have right now is that President Trump is really instinctively not a fan of context. He operates in the now. Michael Gerson, who is Bush 43's best speechwriter, said that President Trump lives in the eternal now, all right? Where he doesn't look at the past, and he doesn't deal with history, and he doesn't really reflect on consequences. Yeah. It's in the eternal now. And so that's one of the real problems, Fareed, that American intelligence now has. By the way, we adjust to all presidents. All of them require some different approaches on our part. This is a president who is incredibly present tense, and our job is to provide that deeper texture to an audience of one who doesn't instinctively ask for it.
I also think, I think that's very well put, and that phrase strikes me very strongly, but I think it particularly applies on this issue of issuing threats and promises. Because I think, I'm going to say it because I think it really is true. If you're in the world of business, you're negotiating a building or something like that, and you say, if you don't do this, I'll do X. Or if you say, this building, I'm not going to pay anything more than $100 million for this. And you get called on it, you can say, oh, shucks, okay, I'll pay 150, right? Or you say, oh, there's a lot of wiggle room. But if you say, I will not allow North Korea to acquire a nuclear missile that is capable of hitting the United States, and it does, I worry that there is an erosion of credibility. There is an erosion of almost national honor. And that's thinking about it in the longer term, but some of the points that you were making, Stan McChrystal, were about this sense of credibility. How can we, you're asking us to trust you with our lives. Can we be sure, you'll be there a month, 6 months, 10 years from now?
And I think the same applies to our foes as well. I remember I was from a big family, and we'd be riding in the car, all the kids acting like wild men, 5 boys and a girl, and my dad would go, you guys shut up or I'll kill one of you. And Now, if he had turned around and shot one of us, the rest of us would have, forever. but over time we said, it's unlikely he'll do it. No probability. And this is the heart of it. And what worries me, and without getting too political, is we're getting deadened to it. We start to hear, I'm going to do this, or I'm not going to do this. And after a while, we automatically discount it. We say, well, Mexico's not really going to pay for the wall. We know that. That's just rhetoric. Our allies and our foes don't know that. And they discount things, and it's very, very dangerous. And so as you get in the world of rhetoric, I just think that the credibility of a nation is extraordinarily important. So the words we say and the actions we take are going to carry into people's psyche for a long time in the future.
And this is 2 presidents in a row. This is President Obama drawing a red line in the sand in Syria, not standing on it, and losing the respect of our friends in the region, and Russia being able to come back in, and folks around the world who are our friends saying nobody fears your president. So that's one president putting lines in the sand, not doing anything about it. Now this president's putting a lot of lines in the sand for whatever macho reasons might be there. But the result, whether you're seen as potentially being weak or seen as potentially being strong, the results for our nation are the same. And if we have back-to-back presidents who are drawing lines in the sand that they don't reinforce, we have a real problem with our first of all with our friends, and then especially with our enemies.
And just to bring it back to the issue we started with, the reason I think we have to think these things through so carefully and so methodically in advance and game out the consequences and use the kind of talent we have here is because if we don't, you're sending young men and women to do something that hasn't been completely thought through, and that it seems to me that is the ultimate responsibility we should all, who even think about these subjects, think about. Okay, now I'm going to get to the elephant in the room. Michael Hayden, we have a situation where foreign power seems to have interfered with the American democratic process. It's done it in Europe, it's done it in the United States. I think the evidence for this, by the way, is overwhelming. There is a very interesting question about whether there was contact or collusion between Russia and the Trump campaign. But there's really no dispute that the Russians were in some way or the other, and you can talk about the extent, trying to interfere in the American democratic process. How should we think of that? Is that is that routine counterintelligence? Is that an act of war?
Not an act of war, but it's not something that we should let pass. And so, again, the longer we go, we're getting a little sharper in our quasi-political commentary. The Russian assault on us, let me define the Russian assault, all right? Very often we say, that Russian cyber attack. This fundamentally wasn't a cyber attack. I mean, the theft of the emails, okay, that's cyber, but that's easy stuff, all right? That can be done by a lot of people. What was really sophisticated and what really mattered wasn't the theft of John Podesta's emails. It was taking the DNC emails and Podesta's emails and other emails and weaponizing the stolen information, washing it through WikiLeaks and DC Leaks, pushing it into the public domain, and then having those stories reinforced by an army of Russian botnets in St. Petersburg that looked as if they were human beings, touching this data on American social networks so that it looked trending on your Facebook account or your Twitter account or in YouTube, and it became part of the American dialogue manipulated by the Russian Federation for multiple purposes. Number one, mess with our heads. Check. Number two, punish Hillary Clinton. He hates her. Check. Number three, make the inevitable President Clinton weaker than she would otherwise be by undercutting her legitimacy. Check. October-ish, September-ish. Holy smoke, that other guy could win. And they started then moving the stories in the direction of a Trump vote. That's fact, just like Fareed said. That is not disputable. Now you got the whole collusion thing, that's Bob Mueller's problem, all right? But what you had was an unexpected attack from an unexpected direction against a heretofore unknown weakness. Right? And by the way, that's a good definition of 9/11 too. And the only way you respond to that is through extraordinary effort, extraordinary structures, extraordinary processes, extraordinary resources. And in our system, that only comes from a presidential commitment. And we have a president for his own reasons, partially because he thinks it attacks his own legitimacy, and at a human level, that's understandable, who has not made that definition and that extraordinary commitment. So we are as exposed to this as we were in 2016. And oh, by the way, it's not waiting for the next election. It is going on now. The most trending hashtag on Kremlin-controlled botnets as we speak is release the memo.
Interesting. You know, I was in Kiev recently and was talking to people in the Ukraine, and they said that what you described was perfectly parallel to what the Russians had done in Ukraine.
Yeah.
They had also, there was a military component, but there was also exactly this effort to dominate social media, to dominate real media, to provide alternative narratives. So, Peter Pace, how to think about this? What should the United States do? How would you counter it? What would you do? Because part of what makes this difficult is it's not like, a normal attack. It's the Russians deny it, it's not clear, some people, and it seems to me what they have exploited more than anything else is the partisan divisions within this country, which allow people to say, well, maybe it didn't happen. So you have, I have to say this, the extraordinary reality of a Republican Party that now seems to want to appease Russia and attack the FBI, which is kind of a weird, role reversal from my entire adult lifetime.
Yeah, I do not have a great answer to what to do about it. I can describe the problem, and the problem is that there are two existential threats to the United States. One is nuclear weapons and the other is cyber weapons. And nuclear weapons have been used 70 plus years ago and thank God have not been used again other than to deter. And cyber weapons are being used thousands of times a day. Thousands of times a day. And not only can folks attack our water and our electricity and our banks and our stock market, but they can also now have impact on our elections and on our divisions. And if you're sitting in Russia, what a great target of opportunity you are developing to take down your main adversary, to make us question the legitimacy of our own election cycle, to help fuel the divisions instead of let us heal. So I work with lots of cyber companies, working on pieces of this, but every single day something else comes up. I mean, I wear a smartwatch, but what that means is that if you want to track where I've been for the last year since I've had it, you can probably track every step I've taken whenever I want it. So we got U.S. military guys who are wearing Fitbits, running around their installations, and now you got maps of our installations around the world that you wouldn't otherwise have. Just as small examples of how this has gotten to the point it's gotten. We have to understand as a nation how threatened we are. We have to then continue to develop, but in a more robust way, our defenses, and we're going to need to triage what's important and what's not, because we cannot protect everything forever. We can only protect some things for a while. And we have to determine what are those some things and for how long, and provide the right resources to it. They have not, to my knowledge, been able to go in and change my yes vote to a no vote. They have impacted my psychology going into vote yes or no, but they have not yet penetrated the machines that I know of to change yes to no. That's another level of problem. So exquisite solutions to problems create exquisite vulnerabilities. One example, the power grid, the smart grid, allows utility companies to provide electricity to various locations And to do so, they have boxes on everybody's homes, and they got it for factories, and that's all good, and it allows us to use the same power plant to run more things. The bad news is that each of those nodes that allows us to modulate electricity to those locations allows our enemies to do the same thing, to turn it off or to modulate. So we have to understand when we create these exquisite solutions to problems for the good of our nation, that we aren't setting ourselves up for a bigger problem.
Finally, Stan McChrystal, one of the things that you became well known for in your military career was leadership and teamwork. It's one of the things you've done a lot outside ever since you left. You wrote this terrific book, Team of Teams. So when you look at the state of partisanship and polarization in the United States, how do you reflect on it? Are we destined and doomed for this? Because I worry now that you even have institutions like the FBI, the judicial apparatus of the United States, that are being turned into part of this partisan warfare. That more than anything else worries me about the future of this country.
Yeah. In 1838, a young congressman spoke at a men's lyceum, a speaking club in Illinois, and said, "From which direction will danger come? Will we be conquered by a foreign power?" And he said, "No. 1,000,000 men in 1,000 years, led by a Bonaparte, couldn't take a drink from the Ohio River. If the United States," and I paraphrase, "is to die, it will because we commit national suicide." That was Abraham Lincoln in 1838. And he was predicting things that we ought to look in the mirror about right now. You'll know the numbers better, but I believe that our recent election, something like 58% of eligible voters actually voted. So the winner of the election actually got less than 50% of 58%, which puts you in the high 20s of actual qualified voters that elect our president. That's a lower voting rate than in Afghanistan. And I was there for 2 elections in Iraq, and I saw the effort people made at great danger to vote. I think it's something like 94% of our congressional districts are what they consider safe, largely, not all, but many because they've been gerrymandered. And so as a consequence, our elections are most fought in our primaries, which pulls us to the left or to the right. It rewards the non-compromise candidate in the primary, and then of course you get to the actual election and you have a pretty much preordained outcome. If you think about that and you think what Australia's done, Australia says you must vote. It's required. Now you could go in the voting booth and vote for nobody. But if you took the money out of our politics or reduced it, you got everybody to vote, view it as their national responsibility to go in there and show up for that, then suddenly voter suppression, all of those things aren't issues anymore. I think if we're going to worry about the world, we ought to look first at ourselves, and we ought to look at the strength of our democracy. We can fix this. This is not something that has to be this way. We're smart people. We can fix some basic things, and we can change the tenor of it, and I think we can move back in the right direction. But nobody's going to do it for us. We have to.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, let me just close by pointing out something that I think should be obvious by now, which is the quality of these 3 men and what it says about us, to end on a hopeful note. Whatever you think about the current political climate, I think we'll all agree the country is being tested in various ways. And I think one source of optimism I have had is some of the institutions are coming out all right. There are institutions that are holding their own independence, that are asserting their own importance, and perhaps the one that is showing a greater degree of professionalism than almost any other is the United States military. I think that I at least am greatly comforted by the fact that there are retired senior military officers in key positions in government. Peter Pace, you better worry because the president seems to like Marine generals. And so, you're the only Marine general here, I think, so you might be next. But are trying to serve their country, trying to do the right thing, trying to ensure that there is some degree of stability, seriousness, and continuity. I've always been impressed by the military for the way it has been able to encourage talent. You see people really rise from extraordinary different backgrounds, the way it's been able to integrate society. But I think what I've seen in the last few years has been a military that has also been able to, stand the test of a democratic military, in that it is trying to help the country, but not do it in a way that in any way one would think that the generals are in control. And that's a very tough balance, but I think you saw reflected in these three individuals the kind of intelligence, professionalism, and integrity that I think the American military has come to stand for. So a big thank you.
Thank you.